All right. It is February 25th, 2025. It's evening. It's a Tuesday evening. And I am here to record a video about this book and read a little bit with you from this work, Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. I think relatively well-known book among the works of Freud that are in popular culture. The original German title was Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, which I think a more literal translation of it would be the discomfort in civilization, or the discomfort of culture / civilization. That double meaning of Kultur would be civilization and culture. Freud's own suggestion to his translator, Mrs. Riviere, Joan Riviere, was man's discomfort in civilization. We could also use the word malaise, the malaise of civilization. But what ended up happening in the hands of Joan Riviere, the title was established as Civilization and Its Discontents. And I personally think it's a good choice insofar as we take discontent to be to indicate, to mean that there's a sense of something is not fully contained, that things are working, but they're also at the same time, while they're working, things might be occasionally or frequently at the verge of a kind of breakdown, at the verge of things going over the line, some kind of civilization line, things spilling over, some kind of spillover. That other thing that civilization is trying to control and contain might come and surface. But there has been some discussion, as my friend Robert Bashara pointed out to me. There are some issues with the title. One of the books that I recently talked about, Jonathan Lear, his introduction to Freud in the Routledge Philosophers, is a philosophical introduction. He talked about in one of the chapters about Freud's critique of morality and religion, and he wrote that, now I'm reading from Jonathan Lear. He writes, in my opinion, these critiques of religion and morality, these are, or they have become, the least valuable aspect of Freud's work. Perhaps in their time, they served as a moment of critique. They do show ways that people can make use of morality and religious systems to gratify unconscious needs, but it is quite a stretch from that claim to the claim that this is the hidden meaning of religion and morality. It's from page 190 of Lear. But nevertheless, Jonathan Lear says that also later in the book, actually earlier in the book, he says that Civilization and Its Discontents contains crucial discussions of the cruelty of superego. The discussion really important, very insightful, the discussion in chapter 7 of this work. Discussion of guilt, conscience, superego. The development of conscience, guilt, the desire for punishment and all that. So Lear believes that that's an important contribution also, and he also writes on page 208 that this work presents Freud's argument that humans are necessarily uncomfortable and not at home in civilization. This is his critique of morality as a social institution. Morality as a social institution as opposed to what? As opposed to an inner guide. There's another comment that I'd like to read for you from Jacques Lacan, and that's from the beginning of seminar series 7. He writes that this work, Civilization and Its Discontents, is not the kind of thing one grants a practitioner or a scientist somewhat indulgently as his way of making an excursion into philosophical inquiry without giving it all the technical importance one would accord to such a thought coming from someone who considers himself to belong to the category of philosopher. Let's take a quick break here. This is very similar to what Daniel Dennett once said in a discussion, that when non-philosophers get into philosophy, We don't apply the same standards. Like if somebody has done work in quantum mechanics or evolutionary biology, when they come to philosophy, Daniel Dennett complained that it's as if we are playing tennis, but we remove the net. And we say, okay, we don't need to have a net. And in that discussion, Daniel Dennett said that we should bring in the nets and have a serious philosophical discussion. And Lacan here says that this view, that let's indulge Freud, that this view is widespread among psychoanalysts and is definitely to be rejected. He goes on to say, Civilization and Its Discontents is an indispensable work, unsurpassed for an understanding of Freud's thought and the summation of his experience. Interesting choice of words, summation of his experience. So it's an important work for understanding Freud. It illuminates, emphasizes, dissipates the ambiguities of wholly distinct points of the analytical experience and of what our view of man should be, given that it is with man, with human beings, with an immemorial human demand that we have to deal on a daily basis in our experience. As I said, that's Lacan, Seminar 7. That is not necessarily incompatible with what we read from Jonathan Lear. Lear said that this work is stretching Freud's psychoanalytic theory. And there is this metaphor of when we stretch something, some things might be revealed about it. When a theory is stretched, it might become more transparent. And for the sake of learning about a theory, a standpoint, a perspective, sometimes maybe it is possible to push it to its limits. So maybe that's one possible way of reconciling. What else can I say? There was another work by Freud that I thought maybe I could discuss before discussing this work. And that's a work that Freud mentions in the very beginning in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And that is The Future of an Illusion, a work about religion. But I decided to postpone the discussion of that because I thought maybe I could integrate discussion of religion and to show you that that discussion is not out of date, that is not anachronistic. I thought maybe I could try to integrate it with a discussion of another book, a recent book called Tech Agnostic, which is about our religious sentiments that are not applied to technology, the promises of technology, the eschatological discussions and other, promises and threats and rituals and all that. So maybe I will have separate discussions of Freud's The Future of an Illusion and Techno-Agnostic, or I might go crazy and synthesize a discussion of those two in one video. I don't know. If you have thoughts on that, please let me know. When The Future of an Illusion, Freud writes that every individual is virtually an enemy of culture. It is remarkable that little as men are able to exist in isolation, they should yet feel as a heavy burden that sacrifices that culture expects of them in order that a communal existence may be possible. I think there was something wrong with the way I read that sentence, but let's just leave it at that. But just wanted to indicate there are common themes touched on in that work and in this work that we are going to spend some time on in this video. Okay, I've selected, as usual, as it has become my practice in the past couple of months. I'm going to read from the book, and I've selected some of the, in my view, key passages, representative, but the book is very intricate. The design of the book is really similar to Freud has in, I think, chapter 1 or 2 in the beginning. He has a description of the city of Rome. And in that description, he talks about how a city like Rome, because of how much history there is to it, the city is layered. Andre Asserman has a discussion of this too in his essay. There are a couple of essays in his Homo Irrealis called In the Shadow of Freud or In Freud's Shadow. Asserman also talks about Freud's discussion of Rome. Rome is multi-layered, that these different remnants, different signs of historical periods are coexisting. You can see a monument from 1,000 years ago. You can see another monument from 800 years ago, 500 years ago. And together, all these things, their coexistence, the way they reach out to the past, reach back in time, that they have their point of origin in different points in time, and the fact that they coexist together. This is something that Freud is using as a metaphor to describe the human psyche and how our experiences pile up on top of each other. And in one moment, in one present moment, the psyche that we have in the present is expressive. There are remnants of all that history. I mention that because the description of Rome, the description that Freud offers of Rome and its history, its multi-layeredness, its messiness, the coexistence of multiple threads, would apply, in my opinion, to this work. There is something about this work that is also multi-layered. It's almost like he couldn't edit it. I think maybe he couldn't edit it as much as he would have wanted, but I like that fact about it. And it's one of those reasons why it's a tricky book to read if you have not read anything else from Freud. It would be very tricky to read this first as your entry. And you might underestimate how much there is underlying some of the things that he briefly mentions, like his references to the psychosexual development of personality and so on, or superego, or instincts. So there's a lot to talk about. This book would lend itself to very different treatments and very different ways of reviewing it. And this is one way of doing it this time, this year, on the February of 2025 by me. I'm reading from page 44. It is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built up upon a renunciation of instinct. How much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction, by suppression, repression, or some other means, of powerful instinct. This cultural frustration dominates the large field of social relationships between human beings. As we already know, it is the cause of the hostility against which all civilizations have to struggle. It will also make severe demands on our scientific work, and we shall have much to explain here. It is not easy to understand how it can become possible to deprive an instinct of satisfaction, nor is doing so without danger. If the loss is not compensated for, one can be certain that serious disorders will ensue. Freud actually writes there, or the translation, if the loss is not compensated for economically, one can be certain that serious disorders will ensue. But in my initial reading, I removed economically because it might be misleading for us. What Freud has in mind is psychic economy, not economy in general. So as he is giving an overview of the field that he is approaching on chapter 3 there, he is also identifying the challenges that what he is going to explain, what he's going to have to make sense of. I'm jumping to page 55. That's from the beginning of chapter 5. We read, "We have treated the difficulty of cultural development as a general difficulty of development by tracing it to the inertia of the libido, to its disinclination to give up an old position for a new one. We are saying much the same thing when we derive the antithesis between civilization and sexuality from the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two individuals in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization depends on relationships between a considerable number of individuals. When a love relationship is at its height, there is no room left for any interest in the environment. A pair of lovers are sufficient to themselves and do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy. In no other case does Eros so clearly betray the core of his being, his purpose of making one out of more than one. But when he has achieved this in the proverbial way, through the love of two human beings, he refuses to go further. He refuses to go further. I'm not reading now, I'm just commenting. We could say he refuses to go further, but we could also say that he is unable to go further without some means, without some instrument. And that's related to Freud's position that culture or civilization becomes an instrument of Eros. That Eros, the desire for binding individuals, creating bonds between individuals, binding them to each other, making bonds between considerable number of individuals, creating a society or a collective among them. In order to do that, it relies on the forces of civilization or the solutions of civilization as its instruments. On the next page, Freud is talking about this commandment or maxim, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. See a solution. Something to follow in order to build bonds with fellow humans. He writes, it is known throughout the world, this maxim, and is undoubtedly older than Christianity, which puts it forward as its proudest claim. But how can it be possible? My love is something valuable to me, which I ought not to throw away without reflection. It imposes duties on me for whose fulfillment I must be ready to make sacrifices. If I love someone, he must deserve it in some way. Then he says how that might be possible. He deserves it if he is so like me in important ways that I can love myself in him. And he deserves it if he is so much more perfect than myself that I can love my ideal of my own self in him. That relates to the discussion of the superego, but let's jump ahead. So we talked about loving thy neighbor, creating communities, Eros using the forces of civilization, but there are always, Freud points out, there are always cracks in that project, in that community. Unification. In that unity, there are always cracks. There's always something that pushes back against that. So I'm reading from page 61. When once the Apostle Paul had posited universal love between men as the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance on the part of Christendom towards those who remained outside it became the inevitable consequence. To the Romans, who had not founded their communal life as a state upon love, religious intolerance was something foreign, although with them, religion was a concern of the state, and the state was permeated by religion. Neither was it an unaccountable chance that the dream of a Germanic world dominion called for anti-Semitism as its complement. And it is intelligible that the attempt to establish a new communist civilization in Russia should find its psychological support in the persecution of the bourgeois. One only wonders with concern what the Soviets will do after they have wiped out their bourgeois. If civilization imposes such great sacrifices, not only on man's sexuality, but on his aggressivity, we can understand better why it is hard for him to be happy in that civilization. Civilized man has exchanged a portion of his possibilities of happiness for a portion of security and a portion of displaced aggression and projection and all the other defenses. Reading from page 67. By the way, that passage that I read for you, the Germanic world dominion called for anti-Semitism and communism, is founded on the hatred of the bourgeois. Walter Kaufmann, who has a book on Freud, Jung, and Adler, praises Freud for that prescience, that Freud knew the downsides, the hidden evils of these utopian ideas, the utopian movements. We are on page 67. I remember my own defensive attitude, Freud says, when the idea of an instinct of destruction first emerged in psychoanalytic literature, and how long it took before I became receptive to it. That others should have shown and still show the same attitude of rejection surprises me less, for little children do not like it when there is talk of the inborn human inclination to badness or aggressiveness and destructiveness, and so to cruelty as well. God has made them in the image of his own perfection. Nobody wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil, despite the protestations of Christian science, with his all-powerfulness or his all-goodness. The devil would be the best way out as an excuse for God. In that way, he would be playing the same part as an agent of economic discharge as the Jew does in the world of the Aryan ideal, or the same role that the Muslim does in our contemporary world. We are now on page 69. He writes, I adopt the standpoint that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition in man. It is separate from eros. And I return to my view that it constitutes the greatest impediment to civilization. Man's natural aggressive instinct, the hostility of each against all and all against each, opposes this program of civilization. This aggressive instinct is the derivative and the main representative of the death instinct, which we have found alongside of eros, and which shares world dominion with it. And now I think the meaning of the evolution of civilization is no longer obscure to us. It must present the struggle between eros and death, between the instinct of life and the instinct of destruction, as it works itself out in the human species. This struggle is what all life essentially consists of, and the evolution of civilization may therefore be simply described as the struggle for life of the human species. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven. Then we get to chapter 7, which is my favorite chapter, touching on superego, guilt, the desire for punishment and order. Oh, there's a footnote about Melanie Klein. And let's go over this chapter, because I have to read all of it. If I decide to read some of it, then I can't do it. It would feel very incomplete. So let's jump to the last chapter, and this will be the last passage that I'll share with you, I'll read again with you. And this is now, we are shifting our attention from the civilization, the image of civilization, to the individual. The development of the individual seems to us to be a product of the interaction between two urges, the urge towards happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge towards union with others in the community, which we call altruistic. And then he says these two are very superficial descriptions. In the process of individual development, as we have said, the main accent falls mostly on the egoistic urge. But in the process of civilization, things are different. Here, by far, the most important thing is the aim of creating a unity out of the individual human beings. It is true that the aim of happiness is still there, but it is pushed into the background. It almost seems as if the creation of a great human community would be most successful if no attention had to be paid to the happiness of the individual, the developmental process of the individual can thus be expected to have special features of its own, which are not reproduced in the process of human civilization. It is only insofar as the first of these processes has union with the community as its aim that it need coincide with the second process. If you decide to read this book, why do I keep going out of the frame? If you decide to read this book as your entry point to Freud, I'd urge you to read it slowly. And it would not be a bad idea to read other works before coming to this work. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention, and I will speak with you in future videos.